Hey, it's Finn. I thought I would give a brief tour of the Logic file of my new song that I released 1 week ago today, called "Come Home." Inspired by Jacob Collier's Logic session breakdown videos, which are, of course, going to be much, much, much more complicated than this. This is the Logic file for this is fairly simple comparatively, but I wanted to kind of show off some compositional techniques that I learned and used for this, as well as some techniques for working with DAWs. Logic in particular is the one I'm using here, but I think that a few of these are going to work in whatever DAW you're using, and also just talk about the different sounds that are inside of this track. Just because I think it would be fun and maybe a little educational. So if you have not already heard my song "Come Home," listen to it before watching this, because I'm not going to play it all the way through in this. I'll just be picking out little segments and explaining them. I'll leave a link to it in the comments or in a card. Let me see if I can point to a card. Do I have my spatial directions good enough? Here? We'll see. Anyway, getting into this. So the one important thing I think to note here is that the song turned out very differently than what I originally intended. I originally wanted this to be a very kind of choppy sample-based thing. So when I started recording all my samples, which is this these guys, this whole stack here, I was recording them as if I was going to be chopping them into little teeny bits and kind of making a more kind of granular thing. But it turns out the actual samples I used from the town, I just used pretty much in their entireties with fades in between them. You can see that's this track here. That is not an easy way to see it. So I've really got, the way I've structured this is there are 3 different sections. Each one is focused around a different location in Harper's Ferry with a fairly unedited sample. I don't think I even changed the volume on this. No, I didn't. Although over here I brought it down so you could hear the vocals. So this first segment, I will solo for a second. This is just me sitting on my front porch having a conversation with my dad. My dad is making these like sounds because he's calling out to deer that are in our yard.
Such graceful, elegant creatures.
Yeah, you can hear him talking about the deer here.
Unfortunately for them.
This second one is a kind of collage of different sounds from the Shenandoah River. So we have this. A lot of people thought that this was rain, but this is actually just the rapids, the Shenandoah River, which fades into this, which is just a different place on the rapids where it's louder, and you can also hear a bit of the highway, Route 340, and then into this, where we're at a more still portion of the river, and we're directly underneath the bridge of that same highway. And then in the third section, we're under the bridge, and you can barely hear the water at all. There's a bit of that kind of sound in the background is the water, but mainly you're hearing these cars that are kind of swelling in and out. So that's the structure of this. But I didn't go into this thinking that this would be the structure at all. I recorded here like all the different samples that go out well beyond the like project range or whatever of just the different places I recorded. There was on the Appalachian Trail. I recorded a good number of trains. down by the church ruins, which is, I think, my favorite spot in Harper's Ferry. I was sad I didn't find a place to put this in the actual thing, in the song. Another recording of the church ruins. Let me expand this guy out so I can move over here. This was down by the Potomac. There's this factory ruins down there. It's a very annoying sound. There's a vent outside a restaurant called the Coffee Mill.
Around.
This is the one I used for part 1. Just the right next to the highway. I was when I was actually picking up the mic at the end of this clip, someone honked at me. I wasn't on the highway. I was on the trail next to the highway, and I dropped the mic, and it got a bit scuffed, but I think it's all right. Here's the rapids that I ended up using the first part of part 2. Here's a spot in the woods that I really love. I call it the hole in the woods because there's this physical big hole made out of rock that you can go down into, and it's a very peaceful place. Here's the train. At some point, I guess I don't really hear the train in this, which is why I didn't use it. It's a very screechy bit of the train. And then these are the ones, right, that I used for the the second one here is the one that I used for part 3. But anyway, my point with all of this is that I did not go into this song in general knowing what I was going to do. I went in with this philosophy of I want to record as much as I can, and then in post essentially figure out how to make it into a song. And this is a philosophy that Andrew Huang talked about in a recent video of his, which I'll also link. I was a little surprised that I was like, this is going to be my big thesis of this video is this whole new technique that I've discovered of recording a ton of stuff, not with having very little idea of how it's going to go into a song, and then making it into a song later after you've recorded it. But then, of course, this was not my idea. And, of course, Andrew Huang makes a very eloquent video about it, which I will link. But anyway, it's still an interesting idea. And the way Andrew Huang talks about it is about, in terms of sound design, and finding all these little sounds you like and sampling them or creating them in sound design sessions using modular synthesis. But the kind of approach that I took here was a very similar philosophy, but in terms of little bits of melody. Now that's the philosophy I ended up using for this first section, but I used different ones for section 2 and section 3 as I kind of became conscious of what I was doing. And then, well, I'll talk about it more when I talk about the sections 2 and 3, but let me just talk about section 1 right now. And then I'll kind of go linearly from here and explain what the different sounds are. So we start out with, again, section 1 is just, oops, that's mute, not solo. Me on the porch talking with my dad. My dad did not know that I was recording.
Marie and Dad just invited us to sit outside of his porch for some wine. You want to go drink one glass over there?
We were social distancing, by the way, when we were on the porch drinking wine eventually. We were actually on the sidewalk, and they were on the porch, Marie and Ned, of Marie and Ned from Finn Mayhew's song Come Home, now our neighbors. But anyway, let me talk about or before I talk about the instruments on here, let me talk about one thing I ended up doing on this, on the background sound here from Harper's Ferry. So I did very little in general on the background sound. Like most of it, I haven't even changed the volume. But I did do something on this clip. And that is, can I find it? There is a compressor. Ignore the EQ, that's for something later. This compressor, so by the way, this is the first time I've ever used compression and known anything about what I was doing. This compressor is not for artistic effect at all. This compressor is for one particular bit, and it's this little bit right here. Listen to this little section that's kind of peaking right here, and then look at the compressor knob. You see how it goes up there? And then for the whole rest of this, the compressor is doing nothing at all. When this knob, it's not a knob, it's a dial, a playhead. It's like a speedometer thing. This needle, right, on this gauge. When this needle is at 0, the compressor is doing nothing at all. But when it goes down like that, you saw, it's lowering the volume. So you can see on the left here, this, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but this left indicator here, this left vertical indicator is the input volume, and the right vertical indicator that looks the same is the output volume. And you'll see most of the time it's exactly the same. But when we hit this bit right here, the one on the right is lower. And what I'm doing here with the compression is I am cutting out a bit of clipping. If you don't know what clipping is when you are too loud into the microphone and the microphone doesn't know what to do and it can't record the full quality of the sound, so it has this unpleasant effect, which I can actually demonstrate by turning off the compressor. So here's with the compressor on. Here, let me actually solo this. Sorry, this is taking so long.
Unfortunately for them, I'm good eating.
And I'm going to turn off the compressor and listen to this.
Unfortunately for them, I'm good eating.
You hear that there's that kind of crackle, that kind of static. That's the clipping. And what the compressor does is, when the volume is just loud enough to start clipping, is it just kind of takes it down. You can see in the actual thing, that's what it's doing, is it's suppressing down the sound so that it doesn't make that unpleasant sound in your ears. Of course, that doesn't change the fact that the microphone, when I was recording it, did not get all the information from this gust of wind that blew by and overblew the microphone. But it means that on this output, it will not have that sound. So that is all I did for this track, or for this, on the Harper's Ferry track for part 1, is just add that tiny bit of compression that only activates during these few seconds to take off that little bite of the wind there. Because I wanted to keep all the sounds of Harper's Ferry as intact as I could to kind of fit with the vibe I was going for the song. So talking about the actual melodic stuff here, the song is structured around melodically, the song is structured around 3 instruments: the ukulele, the piano, and the melodica. And they trade off between the sections who has the ostinato, which is the repeating thing. It's the top track in each one. So in part 1, it's the piano. Part 2 is the melodica. Part 3 is the ukulele. So that's one role the instrument can have. It can be the melody, quote unquote, which in part 1 is the melodica, part 2 is the ukulele, and part 3 is the piano. Part 3 didn't really fit into this model very well. Or it can have what I was calling the glitter, which is just like a little extra thing, just to give it a little more ambiance or texture. In part 1, the ukulele has that. Part 2, it's the piano, and part 3 doesn't actually have any, because I've added vocals there, and it would be a little too cluttered for the aesthetic I was going for in part 3. So for part 1, the ostinato is on the piano. It's this repeated thing. I'll solo it. Oh, sorry, I caught it in a fade in. Oh, that's bizarre. You can hear me through. There we go. I saved us. Sorry, that was going to destroy me. I don't know if that sounded weird at all to you, but I could hear my own voice in a strange way. Anyway, this is the ostinato. And you can see I'm not playing this a ton of times. I'm actually just looping it. This is the same audio clip again and again and again that I've just timed to make it sound like I'm actually sitting there playing it multiple times. I know some of this might be simple for people. I'm trying to make this video as I'm trying to add both like quote unquote basic commentary as well as advanced commentary onto this, just to because it's all the different stuff I'm thinking about and it could be interesting to different people. But anyway, that is what the piano is doing there. It's just doing that. The ending bit I've got it's just a variant that I thought worked well as an ending. What the melodica is doing here is this. Now this might look very different than what the piano is doing because this is a MIDI track. And I think this is something that people might not know about this song when they first listen to it, is this is a very, very digital song. The instrument here isn't really the melodica, it's Logic's EXO-24. I did not know what the name of it was. EXS-24. Which is a sampler. So what I've done is I've actually loaded up, that's the wrong button, all these different melodica sounds into this sampler, which is a digital instrument that you can use to recreate the sounds of other instruments in very fine-tuned ways. And I've loaded them all into this piano keyboard here. And I actually played these on a real piano keyboard, a digital piano I have sitting downstairs. So, like, I've got all these different sounds in here, a lot of which I didn't use. So my philosophy with this is, again, record as much as I can that fits within this. What I did is I had the ostinato from the piano playing in the background while I was recording these to make sure I was still in time and not harmonically in a terrible place or something. But my philosophy was just record as much melody as I can and then fit it later into something cohesive, which is what this MIDI is. So this MIDI, if you don't know what MIDI is a way of digitizing, it's a way of encoding musical events. So each one of these lines here is an event. And if you look at the at this thing, oh my god, I can't zoom properly. Here we go. You can see I've got all these different events with different colors. The colors correspond to the the loudness. And the reason that I was using a sampler instead of just taking all the clips individually from my big list of samples I've got way up here, this gigantic thing. So this is what I fed into the sampler. The reason I'm not taking them and putting them down individually is two things. One, I want to control the volume of each one more finely, whereas if I were just pasting them down here, they'd all be at their natural volume, which is what I am doing for the piano track and the Harper's Ferry track, the background track. But I wanted to very precisely control the volumes of these and how they related to each other. And the second reason that I was playing this in a sampler instead of just placing them down here is because I wanted to have the aesthetic of playing an instrument that was the sampler rather than the melodica. Which might be a stupid thing to say. It sounds dumb when I am listening back to it in my brain. But the kind of idea I'm trying to get across there is when I was choosing which events to pick, which samples, I was not listening back through them one by one, listening back through to them one by one. I was playing them on the piano. And what that does is it makes me not think about how exactly what notes I was playing on the melodica. I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm in this key, I'm playing these notes, this is my articulation or whatever. It totally abstracts it away into just thinking, what are these sounds? Do I like how they go together? Can I make something interesting out of a combination of them that's easily accessible through a piano keyboard? So that's kind of what the sampler allows me to do in this. And what I get out of that is something that I think is interesting and not something I would have come up with were I not using this instrument, the sampler. So the sampler really is the instrument that I'm playing for the melodica part, if that makes sense. The melodica is just like the source of the sampler's information, but the sampler is really the instrument here in some abstract sense. The ukulele part is just this. And I'll explain why that is not just laid out, because it's a single MIDI event, right? The reason that's not laid out, just me pasting it in there, is because for all three of these parts, I had a ton of samples. Like here I am in the ukulele part. Look at all of these, and I only used one. I just used the dum ba da dum ba da dum. That was it. But I had all these things. These melodies. So what I was doing was I was sitting down recording all these things, having no idea what was going to make it into it, and having to be okay with so much of the stuff that I recorded. I mean, so much of this big block here never made it into the song, and I had to be all right with that. And that kind of attitude freed me up to just do whatever I wanted when I was sitting there, and then I could just pull out the best bit, or the bit that fit best with what I was going with in post, and add that in. And what that was this. Just to add a little bit of tension, because we're in this kind of dominant sounding build up. That releases into. Let me wash my hands and that melodica part. So I also actually recorded a ton more on the piano because I didn't know originally when I was recording the piano part which part was going to be the ostinato. So I actually have a ton of stuff on the piano. That just never made it into it because it wasn't what I wanted to do. So it's kind of like it feels like a power move when you're in post going, no, none of this. We're just going to use this one little bit. We're going to loop it. So the whole time we're just using this for the piano. It's a totally different way for me to compose, and it's a lot of fun. So I really encourage people to try that attitude of just recording a whole lot of stuff, no commitment to any of it. So you, in essence, you can't make mistakes, which is crazy. And then taking all the time you need to compose it into something good afterwards. It's just a totally cool thing. And the EXS-24, the sampler, or any sampler, can help you do that. And so that was kind of this big lesson that I learned during this song. So that's part one. Anything I want to talk about compositionally more about part one? Part one is supposed to be the quote-unquote hero's journey. It's supposed to be the you're at home. which is this kind of a, I don't know if it's a play on words, but it's a something to do with the title. All right, moving on to part 2. Before I talk about part 2, there's actually a transitionary bit in the background that I want to talk about, which is just this train sound. I just really like it. I wanted to put it in there somewhere, so I decided this was probably the best place to put it. I was going to have it at the end eventually, or originally, but I decided to put it right here. A lot of the work in this song was properly fading between these different things and finding the pacing of it, because you can't really tell what the pacing is unless you've heard everything before it right up until then. So most of the time I spent on this would be like, all right, we're listening to the first 8 minutes so I can decide if this little bit in the 9th minute fits. And so it'd just be like listening through it. It was very boring. I would listen to it on walks, and then I would listen very closely to see if this one little bit at some particular point fit with the pacing of the whole thing. And then I would tweak it, and then I'd have to listen through the whole thing again. Which, I mean, I'm not complaining. It's a fun process, but it's most of the work in this did not come in recording the instrument parts. I just sat down and recorded those in individual sessions. It came in this deciding on the pacing of everything by listening closely and changing these fades every little, like in little bits. Anyway, so there was my point about all that was I like the train bit going into part 2. Or no, my point about that was about different kinds of work into songs, but I came from that talking about the train part. Anyway, talking about part 2. Part 2, I went in thinking I was going to do the same compositional style as part 1. But what I ended up doing, I thought it was going to be 2 has the ostinato, and I have this this figure. So forth. Excuse me. But what I ended up doing is but by the way, if you've forgotten, part 2 takes place at the river, so it's this, and so the river sound that does not rain. But what ended up happening with part 2 is I just wanted to come in with another ostinato on the ukulele, which was going to be the melody, but I came in with this. Which you'll notice is, how do I click on this? Drawn in MIDI as well. These are the individual events. Well, sorry, it's not drawn in. This was played on the piano, so I actually had no idea what notes I was playing on the ukulele. It was played through the sampler, where of course I've got all these different other things that I have in here that never went into it. So I was using a very similar compositional style, or a very similar recording style as part 1's melodica and the ukulele track, but I ended up just looping it instead of having a continuous melody that goes through. And the reason I did that is because I just thought I like this kind of pyramid structure building thing that was going on during this section for a very constant kind of loud sound in the background. I thought it had the kind of aesthetic of running on a trail next to the river, and you're not when you're doing something like that, like a very repetitive task, and things are the same. The music that's playing in your head is not a straight narrative song thing. It's not something that progresses. It's something that repeats. And so I wanted to capture that here, whereas in part 1 I have this more kind of flowing, linear, something that sounds through composed is the word that I'm trying to get at. Whereas for this one, it's something that builds in complexity and then builds out. So I also reflected that in the piano, where I have this. Oh, soloing it, the loop does not work as well as I thought it did. Anyway, this is that song, My Favorite Things, from Sound of Music. I was originally not going to directly quote it, but the things I was playing on the sampler, or that I put into the sampler, and this just eventually turned into it. And I was like, you know what? I actually kind of love that. So, oh my god, terrible sound from my neck there. I'm sorry. Maybe that's ASMR though. But anyway, this, can I find it? Oh, I don't know where I am. Yeah, it kind of built into that eventually. And again, I had all these things in here I never used. Oh my god, why do I keep doing that? It's going to be this kind of chaotic thing, or... But the whole beauty of sampling is that I could just choose not to use that and choose to just use this little thing that I liked. Just to give it this extra little bit that it needed to fulfill that role of the glitter that I talked about, that the ukulele had in part 1 with its anyway, that's all that's really going on in part 2. There's this constant fade between two very similar sounds, which are and just to kind of ramp up the intensity and also transition a little bit closer to the highway, which is what we're eventually going into in part 3. Speaking about transitions, into part 3 I have this little bit of piano here. That I just really liked. It was something that I recorded in the kind of session that I was recording the different things I was going to put in the sampler for part 2, and I couldn't fit it in, but I really liked it. So I just decided to use it as kind of this calm down bit, which we needed as we go into this more quiet third section that follows this loud second section into this. So we kind of need a bit of time to just kind of calm down and ease into that. So that's what I thought the piano sample did. Kind of working as the train also in between part 1 and part 2. The train kind of ramped it up, and the piano sample is kind of taking it down. Anyway, talking about part 3. Part 3 is where I deviated most from... Oh, I'm sorry. Let me say one quick more thing about part 2. I panned the ukulele sample a little bit on the left, and the piano sample a little bit on the right, just to give it a little more positionality in space, to make it seem like it's a little more enveloping you, whereas this part 1 bit is very focused in the center, just because in part 1 you're at home, and part 2 you're out in the world and things are all around you. But in part 3 I'm in a totally different place. I'm under the bridge here in this kind of not peaceful state, but contemplative state. So I don't know if the sentence I was just saying made any sense, or if the structure of the sentence made any sense. But anyway, what I'm doing in part 3 is similar to part 2, where it's just loops, and no melodies building in or out. But the big difference between part 3 and part 2 is that I recorded everything in part 3 directly into Logic. So I went back to my technique of just recording exactly what I need. So there's no, you'll notice these ones aren't green, they're not MIDI. There's I recorded exactly what I needed because I wanted to make sure I did this outro in a very particular thing. By the time that I had recorded and put in parts 1 and 2, I think I knew where I wanted it to go. And so in order to do that, I wanted to use a method that I was more familiar with, which is laying down what you want, where you want it. So that's why part 3 is like this. So there's 3 different elements here. Melodically, there's the ukulele, which is this sampler. It sounds like one individual track. But that's the reason I have it in 3 is because every time I'd switch to a different chord, I would go dong, and there'd be this string sound. And I just could not figure out how to get rid of that to make a clean switch of the chord. So I just played them each individually, waited for a bit for the strings to die down, lifted up my fingers, dong, put them into the next chord, and then played it, just kind of guessing, hopefully I was still in time. And it turned out I pretty much was, and I was able to edit it a little bit by, or no, I wasn't able to edit it. I actually got it wrong the first time, and I had to totally re-record the sample bit because I slowed down at one bit on this third chord, I think. Yeah, I think so. But anyway, my point is I've lined these up so that it sounds like one continuous session of recording, even though I have chopped it from individual ones. But here, the use of the sampler is not this creative thing I was talking about in parts 1 and 2, especially part 1. It's just to fix my problem of having too much string noise. So like if you actually look into the sampler in part 3, you'll see it's just these 4 ones that I knew I would exactly use. So that's the ukulele, that's what's going on. We got the vocals. Someday I'll learn to get comfortable with gradual change, and the lights will stay up when the snow melts away. Only thing really to note about the vocals is I added a filter onto this, which is the only time I added a filter onto the whole song besides one other instance I'll talk about in a minute. So without the filter, it sounds like what you just heard. I'm sorry, this is an EQ, not a filter. Or I guess they're the same thing. I was using it as a this thing. Low pass filter is the word I was trying to say. So with the low pass filter, it sounds like what you just heard, and without, it sounds. Someday I'll learn to get comfortable. And then adding it back in. Change, and the lights will stay up when the snow melts away. In. It's just like a softer sound. I just thought it fit the aesthetic of the part better, made my voice sound more soothing rather than having these kind of higher overtones. I wanted it to be kind of this mellow mood, so I put in this EQ, this low pass filter onto here. So that's the vocal part. The piano part is just panned a little bit to the right. I don't know why I did that. And these guys just all fold together and oops. And just repeat. These guys do not vary at all. What is varying in part 3 is the background, and this is the only time I'm doing this, besides that little bit of compression in part 1. And also the just nature of the background being this fading thing in part 2. This is the first time I'm really adding, for artistic effect, something onto the background. And what that is is a EQ that is being filter swept as this goes down. So we start out like this, and then as we go, we're removing more and more of the high end until we're down into this low kind of place. And what I was envisioning with that is kind of getting closer and closer to this big pillar that is physically in the place that I recorded, where you can hear the sounds of, you hear less of the sounds of the birds and of the water, and you hear more of this deep rumble of the cars above you. And to me that feels very contemplative, and I wanted this to feel more contemplative as this part 3 went on. So I added that filter sweep into there. It's very subtle as it's going on. It's very slow. And also just to give this part some variation. And I also like the effect that happens as this filter sweep happens, of having the instrumental bits, the melodic bits, be more emphasized, just kind of coming into the light. One final thing that's going on in part 3 is I actually reduced the volume of this whole thing, of the background. I hope I'm not becoming incomprehensible. It is indeed midnight. Hey, it's my birthday. Nice. Anyway, I reduced the volume of the background so that you could hear my vocals better. I did not realize that was a problem until I brought it to my class, and they were like, we have no idea what the vocals are saying right there, and it is annoying trying to hear what they're saying and not knowing what they're saying. You should bring it down. And the thing is, from my perspective, I wrote it, so I knew what they were saying, so it never occurred to me that would be a problem. So it's important to get feedback on your stuff as you're making it. But yeah, that is all the tracks that are in here. Before I go, I realize this has been 42 minutes. It's much longer than I expected it to be. I just want to talk a little bit about what I think this song is about. So the song is called Come Home, which is meant to keep in mind death of the author is something that I definitely believe in. My interpretation is not definitive. This is just what I was thinking about mostly after writing the song, so who knows if it actually went into the composition of the song, but I was kind of interpreting it as this after the fact. So just keep in mind that my interpretation is just as valid as yours. By saying that, am I putting this on some artistic pedestal? Something that is worthy of being death of the authored? I don't know. It's getting late. Anyway, Come Home is supposed to remind you of go home. But come is interesting because it's like the person who's saying it is already there. It's not meant to be come home as in someone talking to someone else who is not home, getting them to come home. It's supposed to be someone talking to themselves, but they are already home. There's a line in a Mountain Goat song, Jenny? No, I don't remember which Mountain Goat song it is, but it's I want to go home, but I am home. And that's kind of what I was trying to invoke with Come Home, the title. The idea is that I wanted to express a kind of not nostalgia, but longing for a place that no longer exists, and that place is the Harper's Ferry that I grew up in, which very literally doesn't exist because people have painted their houses different colors, trees are planted, trees are being removed, and most notably, it's a different set of people than when I was growing up. Ned and Marie, for instance, from the very beginning of the song, I did not know. I mean, Ned was not here, Marie was here, but I didn't know her. But in this kind of version of Harper's Ferry I experienced growing up, those two people were not in it. There was all these other people who are no longer here. And I just kind of wanted to remember that Harper's Ferry and celebrate it, but also note that it is no longer here. So that's what the song means to me. the lyrics, someday I'll learn to get comfortable with gradual change and the lights will stay up when the snow melts away. First line, someday I'll learn to get comfortable with gradual change, is just that. I guess talking about not living in the moment, being thinking about where am I in my journey constantly, like, oh, I finally reached this version of myself that I'm proud of or something, but not realizing that you're constantly in this process of change and being okay with that change and being comfortable in that change, not thinking I'm going to get to some place of comfort, but being in that place of comfort. So the I guess ironically that line is saying someday I'll learn to get comfortable with gradual change is looking for that in the future instead of right now, saying someday I'll be in the place where I can appreciate today, that moving today. I don't know, that line actually is what I started kind of, I might be misremembering this, but in the narrative I'm telling myself, and you all, the line just kind of came to me as I was humming for this melody. The melody here is reminiscent of What's Up by Four Non Blondes. Hey, 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 hey. And I say, hey, what's going on? Someday I'll learn. And I said, hey, hey. That's what I accidentally copied. But I like it. Anyway, the second line is, and the lights will stay up when the snow melts away. I guess it's the second and third line. That's saying, it's just kind of a more metaphorical expression of the first line. What I was referring there are Christmas tree lights, and how sometimes you forget to take them down when the winter ends, and how it's kind of nice that they're still there, because in one sense you were preoccupied or something and you didn't think about being super efficient and managing your house or your space, but you accidentally through your inefficiency you left up the Christmas tree lights and kind of added this nice thing, and maybe the reason you weren't as efficient is because you were more in the moment. And also I just like Christmas tree lights. So that's the lyric. Someday I'll learn to get comfortable with gradual change and the lights will stay up when the snow melts away. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about this song. I encourage you, if you are someone who writes music, to write using the technique I talked about closer to the beginning of recording a whole lot of stuff and then choosing later and putting it together later how the song will go. And of course that only works for certain idioms, like more digital idioms. Is there anything else I want to say about this? Nope, I don't think so. Thanks for wait. There's one more thing I want to say. This totally disrupts the flow. But if you're wondering how I lined these up in order that they loop well with this ukulele part, watch this. This is my technique. Duplicate, duplicate, copy, paste, move these down, align these. Wait. Am I screwed? Did I forget how to do this? Okay, I'm sorry. Before you actually duplicate a set of two, so you manually align two. You duplicate them, move them down onto these temporary tracks, align them up, and then you can go in and precisely align it. Delete these two and move these two up without actually shifting their position. And that's how you perfectly, or as perfectly as you can, loop things without actually using the loop function of Logic, which only works if you don't have space between them, as far as I know. Anyway, I should have put that in when I was talking about the Logic bit and not the song bit. But anyway, I'm becoming delirious. It's my birthday. It is 12:15 a.m. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. If you want to tell me anything, feel free to do so in the comments. I had a lot of fun making the song. I think it's some of the best stuff I've made. I am proud of it, and I am glad that I learned the lessons that I did about songwriting while I was making this. So thank you, Professor Sergey, who was my composition professor, who facilitated me using time to make this and gave me a grade for it. Yeah. Adios.